Today's interview is with Dr. James Spadaro. Am I correct? Am I saying your name correctly?
Yes.
So Dr. James Spadaro, who's a cardiologist in private practice. Dr. Spadaro, can you say something about your work, what you do, and what what your practice is like?
Yes, sir. I've been doing interventional cardiology ever since it began. I started in Washington University in the early 80s. I did the first successful angioplasty there. And we did the first TPA studies there on patients for acute infarction. And I just stuck with it ever since. It's been just a wonderful, wonderful career. And I wouldn't do anything differently than I've done, really, truly.
So my father had an angioplasty in, I think, maybe 85. It was done by a cardiologist at Bryan Memorial in Lincoln, Nebraska, who learned how to do it by going to an Andreas Grunzig seminar. How did you learn to do angioplasty?
Well, I was the Mikey of the group back then at Washington. I was on the staff. I was an assistant professor, and I was recruited there because I'd done a year of surgery as part of a urology residency, which I stopped the urology and went into internal medicine. And so they needed somebody to do angioplasty. So they said, why don't you go down to Texas, the Texas Heart Institute, and take a class. So I did. And I came back, and they had the first person in the world ever to get successfully lysed with TPA, who was left with a 90% right coronary artery stenosis. So I didn't have any better sense. So they put the instrument in my hand to dilate the artery. And of course, you get the massive ST segment elevation, and it scared the heart out of me. I thought, okay, here it goes. My career is over. I'm done. I'm going to kill somebody right here, and I'll be banished to the woodlands ever since. It didn't happen. The patient did fine, and we actually wrote it up and so forth. But that's kind of how I got the start with everything.
Where are you now currently? Where's your practice?
I'm slowing down, Dr. Gutenberger. I had been in. Well, I went from Barnes, and I taught for 3 years, and we wrote a number of papers, and it was a great amount of fun. And then I went into practice with an older physician who was excellent, and that was a lot of fun because when he sent somebody to the cath lab, they needed something done 9 times out of 10, and that's before all the sophisticated testing. He was just really good, and it was a lot of fun to work with him. And then after that, I went on my own for 23 years, and that was probably the most gratifying work as far as being personally satisfied that I've ever done, because you really get to know the patients and you really connect well, and it was really enjoyable. And then the landscape changed, and that wasn't really tenable financially because of restructuring of healthcare around 2012. So 2013, I joined a group, actually 2 groups. I joined one group 2 days a week in St. Louis, and then another group out of town where I'd had a clinic for 20 years, 3 days a week. And then a year ago, I started getting kind of worn out. And so I quit the St. Louis job, and I just kept the 3-day-a-week job out of town. And so that's what I do now. And as of a month ago, I got the statistics at my age, approaching 70 years old. 99-point-something% of interventionalists are out of the cath lab. I didn't get the memo. So I finally realized that yeah, there does come a time when you need to let the younger guys do the high stress stuff. And so now I just do office 3 days a week.
So where was your original private practice, and where are you now?
All right, to start with, when I left Barnes, I worked with Dr. Ball at St. Anthony's Hospital in South County for a long time. And I was, most of my time was Missouri Baptist, and then the last 10 years or so with SSM at St. Clair. Actually, I helped start the lab at St. Clair and get that going, and that was a lot of fun. So, but I was hired at Phelps to start an interventional program there, which we did, and we've had very good results. So it's been a lot of fun there too.
So one of my colleagues, Dwight Look, grew up in Rolla, and after he left his longtime position at the University of Iowa, he was briefly in private practice at Phelps in Rolla, and I think he was the only pulmonary intensivist on the staff at the time. Were you the only cardiac interventionalist?
Yes, I was. We finally hired somebody else to help out about 2 years ago, and that's worked out pretty well. He does a fine job too. So
you alluded briefly to how you ended up in cardiology. Could you say a little bit more about that, the journey from medical school to surgery to internal medicine to cardiology?
I'd be glad to. I think that might be helpful for people trying to find their way, because I certainly had a few bends and twists in the road. I started out as a senior medical student, had a really good rotation in urology of all things. I read 2 out of the 3 books, Campbell's Urology, the volumes, and I had visions of doing epispadias repair, hypospadias repair, a bunch of congenital stuff that never comes along. And so then the program was to do 1 year of internal medicine after doing a surgical internship. So I did the surgery. I think it's important for the younger people to know, you got to see where you're comfortable. Yeah, not only the work, but the people. I didn't fit in with the surgeons very well. I got along with them, of course, but they just had a different personality type. And I think that's really key if you're looking at subspecialties, where you have to see what group you really are in sync with. That's really, really critically important. Long story very short, I met my future wife. I finished my year of medicine, which I thoroughly enjoyed. I started in a urology formal residency, and she said, "Your personality's changing. There's something wrong with you." And I said, "Well, I'm the same person." She said, "No, you're not." And I said, "Well, yeah." And she said, "No." And so I said, "Okay." And I had to do some really, and this is important, really critical self-analysis as to whether I was really fit for what I was doing. And the answer was I wasn't. I didn't want to look at people's bottoms the rest of my life. I didn't need to. It just wasn't the sort of thing that I think it was diagnostically very stilted. You either had stone disease, cancer, structural problems with the bladder, prostate. You can name on the fingers of one hand all the diagnostic possibilities. And one of the urology residents said, he was from Nacogdoches, Texas, and he said, "Jim," he said, "if you don't know the diagnosis of a urology patient after talking to him for 5 minutes, you probably never will." And that was absolutely true. So anyhow, the long story short, I got out of it and I did general medicine for 10 months. And that was interesting. And I think that was the hardest job I ever had, because you were all over the board. And one day I remember I had a subluxation fracture, unstable angina, all kinds of skin lesions. And I was thinking, gee, this is like playing hockey with the net behind you, being the goalie with the net being like 30 feet across. You just were all over the place. And that was part of starting me towards thinking about specialization at that point. But so I got I finished internal medicine, and when I did a rotation in cardiology, the head of the department said, "Well," he said, "you ought to think about going into cardiology. You'd be very good at this." And I said, "No, not me. I've already tried specialization. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to be a generalist." He said, "Okay." So, and needless to say, I did other rotations that I really didn't feel that suited me very well. So I stuck with cardiology. Now, I wasn't going to apply to Barnes. My wife applied to Barnes, and her logic was very simple. I said, "Why?" She said, "Because it's close. It won't cost you very much to travel there." And I said, "Oh, okay. So you fill out the papers because it's a waste of time. They won't want somebody like me." But this is important. What I didn't know was the reason they wanted me was because they had anticipated the need for somebody to do interventions. They wanted somebody with technical skills who could do procedures. And I'd done a year of surgery, and so so they thought I'd fill the bill in it. And it was really pretty brilliant on their part. It worked out very, very well. And so I just stayed with it. And then when I finished, they offered me a job, and I taught for 3 years. And by the time I left Barnes, I got to say, there wasn't anything that can go wrong with the heart that I hadn't seen or treated or diagnosed or dealt with at least one time. And it was wonderful. And it was just an amazing time in my life, it really was.
So you sort of alluded to, the various practice models you've been. You've gone from academic to private practice fee for service to, it sounds like, a more structured salary arrangement. Could you maybe say something about each model and, why you chose change at each step of the way?
Absolutely, sure. The academic aspect of it was just wonderful from an intellectual standpoint. I mean, gee whiz, Bert Sobel was there, just Alan Jaffe. There's a bunch of real giants in the field who you rub shoulders with every day. It was just an amazing time. And that part I've never been able to replace, and I don't think I ever will. The pay was low. That was what you expected with an entry academic job. But the work satisfaction was really good. But then I finally figured out that, my family was getting bigger, and we had to be honest about it. I mean, they wanted things like shoes and clothes and all that, and so I thought, well, I owe something to them. And plus the learning curve leveled out, to be honest with you, because when they sent me somewhere else to learn how to do angioplasty, I knew that I could send myself someplace to learn as well. So they had a big dinner for me, and it was really nice. And I left on excellent terms and with the fondest of memories from WashU. I really had a good time there, really did. And I went in, and practice was just a natural step forward. And I did the interventional part, and my partner was non-invasive and very, very experienced, very good guy, trained in London and trained at WashU as well. And then solo practice was just, at the time, that seemed to be I just like to run my own show. And the advantages of solo practice are, not that I don't know that you can do it anymore because of the way that things are structured now, but back then you could. But the advantages are that you can set up your own business. You can run things like you want. You can determine your own schedule. You can determine what kind of employees you want, how much you want to compensate them, et cetera. So that you have a lot more flexibility in running your own operation. But it's very gratifying because you know the families, you know the patients. It's the hardest, though, I would caution, because you really are really serving a lot of people by yourself. And it's the hardest. You don't share much intellectually with other doctors as much of your specialty. So that makes it a bit harder too. But I did that, as I mentioned, till it came time when what happened was they kept cutting the fees in the early, around 1912 or so, 2012, to the point where, we had built out a cath lab on the 4th floor at the old St. Joe's building, the hospital there. And we were making money doing casts for, I think, around, a very modest amount of money, probably $1,000 for everything. So they kept cutting the outpatient fees to the point where it wasn't viable to stay with that model anymore. So we didn't have any choice. I couldn't take a partner because I couldn't offer them enough money. The hospitals got more money at that time instead of less. So they were charging $20,000 for a stent. We were charging like $1,000 or $2,000. So it was you can't compete. So I realized I had to get out. But working with other people, I think, has huge advantages in a number of ways. One is you have colleagues who you can run things past, which is very helpful. Also, if you have good partners, they can support you in a lot of different ways in terms of call relations and just the way that things are structured and how you help each other. Good partners are invaluable, and that can be very enjoyable also. And semi-retired, I think, is the best, really. No, I'm just kidding.
So what was your, and I think that there'll be quite a number of people will be interested in this. What was a typical day like for you when you were a practicing interventionalist? What was your day like? What would you do?
Sure, that's a great question. And it didn't seem to matter what the format, whether I was employed or whether I was on my own or I was working with another doctor. It came out for me anyway to be about 2 days a week in the cath lab and about 3 days a week in the office. And that balance has been pretty consistent for a long time. The reason that I liked it, because I like procedures. Well, I'm going to start out with surgical type of interest, but I also like the medical problem solving. And cardiology had both. And I don't know, over the years from the medicine, we used to have, when I started medical school in 1972, we had like 3 cardiac drugs total. Now we have 10 types of beta blockers. I mean, 10 brands, or, so things have just mushroomed astronomically with the medical treatment alone, which I have always found very interesting. And we're not done. They're still coming out with new things, obviously, for lipids and everything else. So the typical day would be, for me, would be do some rounds in the morning, see consults if you need to in the morning, see the patients in the office, and then clean up in the afternoon if there's the evening or whatever, if there's stuff left over. Cath lab would be, depending on how the thing is set up, a lot of places will assign you some times and then you add on to it during the week. if you have other people that need stuff who are unstable, if you have a good partner who can pick up for you, that makes life a lot less stressful. If you're the only one doing it, like I was at Phelps for a number of years, it can be rough because you've got to stop your office and go, pick up somebody, care very quickly in the emergency room, which is stressful. But,
what was it like? What was it like being in effectively solo practice in terms of covering your nighttime emergencies and so on?
It was very stressful. I'm not going to lie about it, because you'd have to be available, and sometimes, and I had outreach clinics, so I was spread pretty thin, and that, I'm not going to lie, that was stressful. It was kind of hard. I ran around a lot, but
Did you feel like you were getting burnt out doing that?
Actually, no, that didn't burn me out. It was the most burnout I've ever had, quite honestly, was I took the first boards for interventional cardiology when they first came out in 1999, and I did great. And then in 2009, I took them again. And then I said, if I take them again in 2019, when I'm in my mid to late 60s, just shoot me, because that'll be the dumbest thing I've ever done in my life. And so it rolled around, and I was hemming and hawing. My wife said, go ahead and take them. It was 3 months before the boards were supposed to be given, and the American College recommended 6 months preparation. So as usual, I followed my wife's dictates before I do anything else. And so I crammed all of that into 3 months, and I did fine, but I didn't want to read an article about anything, truly, for a year. I mean, I had to force myself to do anything academic at all. So that was real burnout.
So, this is maybe not necessarily the subject of this conversation, but I'm curious to know what you think about maintenance certification and how useful it is as a practicing subspecialist.
I think it's very useful, and I think it's necessary. And I think it was a great idea, because what I think I was subject to for my burnout was just that. It was indigestion. I just got academic indigestion, bad. And I think the idea of having it meted out over time is much, much better idea, truly. Because then that gets you into a habit of regularly revisiting the latest in your field, rather than just cramming once every 10 years for an exam, aside from going to meetings and stuff or whatever.
Did you have time in your practice to go to meetings?
I made time. Every year I went to the TCT, spent an entire week someplace, and plus I'd go to local meetings as well. Yeah, that was vital. I'd have gotten behind in interventional work as fast as it changed. Very, very early on, I'd have gotten really far behind if I hadn't done that.
So, speaking about work-life balance, you mentioned your wife applied to Barnes as well. Is she a physician?
And she applied for me. She filled out the form.
Oh, but she's not a physician.
No, she's a nurse, but she is the best support you ever have. She makes sure that everybody in the family has great careers.
Well, so then with a very demanding career like you have, how did you manage, your work life, your home life, your family life, and so on?
I spent a lot of time stopping rounds, driving to see little girls play baseball and volleyball, and going back and finishing rounds. And I spent a lot of time stopping, cutting out part of the day, in the middle of the day in the office, going to see a Christmas pageant or God knows what. Yes, I made time, but it was not easy, and it is not ideal. I'm not going to lie about it. It was hard. That part.
Did that cause stress in your life or your marriage at that point?
My wife has been wonderful. To this day, she's never once truly complained about anything work related at all. She just hasn't. That's just how she understood and accepted that was part of the deal. But it was stress. The stress was there, but I think we dealt with it fine. Really good.
Good. Do you have grandchildren now?
We have 6 grandchildren, and one of whom we got to keep locked out of this room, or they'll hear the little kid running around in the background.
Are you having a little bit more time to enjoy them?
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. I have 2 days off a week, so I have a 4-day weekend every weekend. So it's been nice. Yeah.
In addition to your CME time when you were in practice, were you able to take vacations?
It was hard in private practice and solo practice, because every minute that you spent away from the office is you still have the overhead running. There's nobody to cover it. So that was one of the biggest shocks when I was employed, was that there's actually still money coming in at the end of a vacation. That was a phenomenal thing to me, you know. So
I haven't asked, and I should have, and I will ask the next private practitioners. You know, I think many residents at this point have not thought about this at all. You know, one of the differences about being in private practice is that you know, as opposed to being in academics or being in a group practice that's run by a practice manager, is that you're responsible for, you know, covering the expenses associated with your own vacation. There's no such thing as paid vacation. You're responsible for your own health insurance. You're responsible for disability, life, the cost of your CME, and so on. How did you work that out? How did you handle that?
the administrative part of the office, the key to running a good office, in my opinion, is you hire the best people you can find. You let them do their job and stay out of their way. You support them. You pay them as much as you can, not as little. Pay them as much as you can, justifiably. And I had two people that stayed with me for 20 plus years. You know, so that's how you get good people to stay with you for a long period of time, and you get loyalty from your staff. And they did a lot of the legwork. They really did, which made it a lot easier.
How hard was it to discipline yourself to make sure that you were funding your own retirement plan?
Not too hard. I mean, I just set it up in traditional ways, and I put as much away as I could. You know, we never really lived lavishly or anything. I mean, it was just the ordinary lifestyle. You know, it wasn't hard.
I remember back when, you know, back years and years ago, when there were, you know, when pharmaceutical companies were doing a lot more print advertising and there were a lot more throwaway journals, I remember reading any number of articles about office staff who embezzled, you know, and oftentimes it was doctors who were too trusting of their office staff. Did you ever have any kind of problems in those regards, or ever worry about it?
Always worried about it, never had it. We had one gal who was in an ancillary office who stole some of the copays. We found out about it quickly and put an end to that. But it is a problem. My brother-in-law is an internist, and they did have problems with embezzlement. You do have to watch your books, you really do. Yeah. And
did you do that yourself, or did you hire an outside accounting firm?
Some of it I did myself. I would look over the books each month. We did have a good accountant who would look at things periodically as well. Yeah.
Thanks. So, you know, again, in terms of when you made the jump from academics to private practice, are there any things that you wish you knew then that you know now in sort of looking at a private practice that you would advise residents to know about?
The first thing I would say is everything is negotiable. When you go to talk to a recruiter or whoever's represented a group practice or whatever it is, they will start out by trying to pretend to you that there's one way or the highway for everything. It is absolutely not true. Everything is negotiable. And that goes from salary to model for pay to time off to benefits. Everything is truly negotiable, and it's important to keep that in mind. One of the negotiations that I had, I was told that because whatever the institution was did it this way, I would have to agree to, what was it? You know, no compete clause. And I said, well, I've already got my own business, and there's no reason for me to agree to prevent myself from taking back my own business if you fire me. So I can't agree to that. And so my attorney said, they've never agreed to that before. And I said, well, they did this time. So everything, the only reason I mentioned that is because truly everything is really negotiable, and they'll pretend like it isn't, but don't be bluffed. You really can negotiate. Second thing is, know what your worth is in the medical marketplace. I had no idea. I finished, I had an illustrious time of it at Barnes, and I knew my stuff backwards and forwards. I'd written papers. I had been on the cutting edge of what was going on. And I was an extremely valuable commodity at that time that I had no idea about. I just knew that I did pretty good at what I did, and that's all I knew. So don't be afraid to, if you're really sure of your stuff and you've done a great job, you can stand on your own 2 feet and go ahead and make some demands. Don't be hesitant to do that.
But what kind of resources should residents look at to try to understand what they should be paid in your view?
You can, one great way to do it is just to well, one way is just to apply for a few jobs and see what they offer you. Another way to do it is you can hire a recruiter, and they usually have a really good idea what the market is like. That's not a bad way to go either. Here's another thing that I learned the hard way, and that's that if the recruiter or the hospital or whoever you're talking to tells you, oh, well, yeah, we put in there that we have the right to fire you with 1 week's notice, but that'll never happen because you're a great guy. And just trust us, really. That's just one of those things that things don't work out, but they're going to work out beautifully. Believe what's in the contract. If they put it in there, they're not kidding. They're really not kidding. They really will act. That's going to be what governs. It's going to be what's written. So to that end, I would say, make sure you, first of all, hire a good lawyer. Pay the money, get somebody who specializes in medical contract work, because there's a lot of people who don't know all the ins and outs. And speaking of how much you're worth in the marketplace, they know as well as anybody because they write the contracts. They're a good source for that too. But anyway, but get somebody good and get them to write up a contract. Second, make sure you understand every word in that contract. Make them translate it for you. So some things that sound one way in legal terms mean something totally different in English, and you'll misunderstand what you're signing. Take the time, learn everything, and if you want to add something, put it in. Third thing is just go ahead and what was the other point? Oh yeah, if you can't live with something in the contract, no matter how unlikely it is to occur, go ahead and debate it up front. See if you can get it changed. Don't agree to anything you don't agree with, because what can happen is things can change, and then you can find out that they're going to act on what's on the contract. And even though you thought it would never happen, if you agree to it, believe me, they will go ahead and do what they want with that contract.
So how does one go about finding a good medical contract lawyer?
You can talk to your regular lawyer and ask them to refer you. I think that's probably the best way. Or you can talk to other people who have already done it, or you could, I don't know, it's just word of mouth, or I don't have a good way to answer that question. I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah.
So looking at your first job, are there red flags you should look at that should make you run screaming in the other direction if you see it?
Oh yes, I did write down a few of them because I think that's very important too. If you go someplace and you find out that there's been 5 cardiologists there in the last 5 years, big red flag. They're not all dumb people. They're not all incompetent. They left for a reason. Pay attention. The other thing that is really important is if you tour the facility and you talk to the people and you find out that there's not sufficient support for what you want to do. In my case, it was interventional cardiology. That was kind of an interesting story. I went to Phelps County. They recruited me. I went up there to visit, and we had some conversations. And I said, well, I'm going to need about $300,000 worth of new equipment, figuring they'd say no. No, they said yes. I said, well, I'm going to need some specially trained people, and you might have to hire some expensive people to come in and travelers, because we've got to get first-rate people here to get good results. I figured they'd say no. They said yes. And they wanted me to work 5 days a week. And I said, I think my wife will put up with 3. I don't think she'll put up with 5, and I want to stay married. So I thought they'd say no. They said yes. So, but the main point though, clearly they didn't have the facilities that I needed, but there was an overwhelming willingness to provide whatever it took to get a first-class program going. And we did. But if you go to a place and they don't really have, they're not willing. I think the willingness is the most important thing. They're not willing, or you get the sense that they're not really going to support you, either with staff or equipment, then you need to really consider that. The other thing is pretty obvious, but needs to be stated, is if the reputation of a place is poor, then be really careful with that, unless you're being brought in to build a program, like I was. I mean, Phelps County had no reputation for intervention because they didn't do any. So it wasn't that I was joining one that already had a fantastic reputation, but I was being brought in to develop a program. That's a little different. Another thing to be on the lookout for is if you have vague language in a contract where they don't really specify exactly how much time off you're going to get, and you're going to be the only cardiologist on the staff someplace in the country, say. Look out, because that means that they might mean to take advantage of you, that's all. So any vague language, look out for. And the other thing is to look out for productivity clauses in the contract. Productivity, you got to remember, we're like ball players, okay? You go to the medical marketplace today, you're a ball player. You basically have whatever you have to offer, and then they have whatever they have to offer, and you work out terms. And if you don't like it, then you part ways. You join another club, if you will. So so you don't control the whole operation. So they could set you up with a productivity clause where half your income is dependent upon how hard you work. And you would be a hard worker and very confident in what you do. But what if they bring in somebody else and then they shunt a bunch of patients towards somebody else and you have no work to do? Or what if they hire people at the front desk on the cheap and they're really lousy and they alienate the patients and you have no business? There's 1,000 ways. What if you have a biller? What if their biller doesn't do a good job and they wind up undercoding all of your stuff just for their convenience, so they don't have to write follow-up letters or God knows what? They set the thing up. They set your schedule up. What if you want to see 25 people a day and they don't want you to go past 4 o'clock because then they have to pay for their employees to hang out longer and they don't want to do it? You can't control that if you're employed. So I would say be really careful about the productivity clauses. Get what you want up front. If you think you're worth a certain amount of money, have them pay you that. And then if they want to add some productivity in there to boot, that's fine. But to have the mainstay of your compensation be due to productivity, that's way too much power in their hands, in my opinion. That's just my own opinion.
So, you've been through a lot of changes. Like me, you're getting older and you've seen a lot of different things come and go. Are there any things on the horizon you see coming in the medical future that you think are important or would impact on people's decision about what kind of medicine they should take or whether they should go into medicine at all?
I think the most important thing really is just the relationship with the patients. I really believe that. And no matter how many roadblocks are put up by the government or by third-party payers or by hospital systems or God knows what, computer systems, that's something they can't ever take away from us, honestly. And that's to me the most satisfying part of the whole thing, and that will always be there. I think people should go into medicine for one good reason, because they want to go into medicine and they want to serve other people. And if that's your motivation, you'll be satisfied. You'll be happy. If it's not your motivation, then you might have some problems along the way. I think what I see as far as where medicine is going, clearly the private practice days and the independent group days are pretty much gone, at least as things are structured currently. That's likely to continue because it's a huge business. There's a huge complex between the equipment manufacturers, pharmaceutical houses, and the academic centers and the government. It's a big complex that isn't likely to change. So I think you should go into medicine. I think that the future is bright, but it's different, is where I would sum it up. I think there's some things when you go into practice that you have to make sure that you can have good contact with your patients, meaning that they don't have so many obstructions or barriers that you really can't enjoy the doctor-patient relationship. In other words, if you can't see the same patients back, for example, or if you can't follow your own patients, or if you don't have enough time, or if you're forced to, there's not enough flexibility in the schedule to really spend the proper time to really get to know your patients as such. But I think as far as internal medicine, I think, there's some concerns out there that we have 900,000 physicians in the country. There are 280,000 nurse practitioners. There's 30,000 nurse practitioners every year that are going entering the marketplace, and there are 16 new osteopathic schools. So that's just the facts. So where does internal medicine fit in with that? My opinion is that there will always be a place for medical excellence, and nobody can get rid of that. I think that the opportunities for the internists, if you want to, there's obvious subspecialization avenues that are available, and we talked about some, at least cardiology from my standpoint. But I think that the high risk stuff and intensive care with the intensivists will be there forever. Nobody can replace you. I mean, if you have, they're vital. You got to have really good people in the ICUs. To a lesser extent, the hospitalists, I think, is another that everybody's familiar with, another career path. And that is more subject to competition among lesser skilled people than is the ICU, but still, I think, could be very satisfying for somebody. Then the third is obviously the office. And I think the office it can be very rewarding. It just depends on what you want. But I think the most important thing is to really find out what you enjoy and really stick to what you enjoy, and don't worry about as much about the rest. I think, you know. I think that the American College, if I may say, would do well to have a higher level of training for general internists, and have one of the biggest needs I see personally is someone to connect the dots between super specialized cardiology, super specialized pulmonary and oncology, et cetera. So to have people really trained with the interface of disease. I don't know how to explain it that well, but I guess I do. You have the emerging field of cardio oncology, for example. Well, if you could, you know, have additional certifications and training for people, and then pay them for it, then they would be in an excellent position to supervise some of the people with less skills, which is going to be, that's going to be the biggest need, I think, because you'll have all these practitioners and everybody else with whatever skill level. They'll take the low hanging fruit, but the 10 to 20% of cases that are complicated, they're going to need help with. And I think that's a huge place where the American College could do a great job, even so much as training the nurse practitioners in advance to give them an advanced certification and degrees to promote the quality of their work and make them more amenable to what the American College thinks is important, rather than being dependent upon nurse education like we are currently.
So are there other questions I should have asked you that I didn't?
I think you've covered a lot of things, and I really appreciate the opportunity to share some of my experiences with you and with whoever else might be interested in watching this video. I do think one of the things that really is important is just really, you know, to be just a few comments about how you can be happy with the practice of medicine. You know, the first thing is that the first requirement, in my opinion, is you should know your stuff. And when I finished Barnes, I knew my stuff. I really, truly did. And there's nothing more satisfying academically than walking into a room and boom, 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 knowing ABC exactly what's going on and what to do. And you have to do that. Remember one thing, even the dumbest of people are really smart at figuring out if you know your stuff. They can tell if you don't know what you're doing. They really can. Even really slow people are really fast at that. Don't try to fool them. Learn your stuff. Second point, you should follow your heart. Just do what you're put on earth to do. Don't let anybody talk you out of it. When I went into cardiology, people said, don't do cardiology. And I said, why? They said, because there's too many people in it. You won't find a job. And I think to a certain extent that was true. I had to do some outlying clinics to make a go of it. But my goodness, I'd have been a terrible dermatologist. All those lesions look the same to me. Gastroenterology, the same thing. I mean, endocrinology, I'd last 10 minutes. You know, I'm still looking for my first case of pseudo hypoparathyroidism or whatever. So, but be true to yourself. You know, the other thing is pay attention to who you gel with. I mean, do you really like it when you walk in the cath lab and there's this guy opening up an artery and you see him back on the floor and they're nearly dead and they come back to life? Does that turn you on? Or do you want to run in the other direction when somebody's in the emergency room with the blood pressure 60/40? You know, just follow your heart and be true to yourself and be honest with yourself. And then be willing to change, just like I did. If you find that the shoe does not fit, you think the shoe does not fit your foot, then you got to be willing to change. If you go into oncology and you find out you're depressed, get out. If what's not a fit, go ahead and quit. It's better earlier than later. How do you set up your office? Here's some comments on that. What I do, when you make sure that you try to restore the doctor-patient relationship as much as you can. Don't bury your nose in a computer. Big mistake. People hate it, and you lose all the body language, which is vital. I mean, if somebody looks at you and you say, "How are you doing?" They say, "I'm fine." That means they're really not. But if you're not looking at them, you'll miss that communication altogether. So what I do, and I suggest you do, is when I first see the patient, the first thing I do is say, is there anything that's going on that you have any questions about? Is there anything that you're concerned about? Do you have any questions on your medicines? Do you have any questions on how you've been feeling? And then you can use the time while you're doing your COVID hand washing to let the 90-year-olds think about what's going on. And they don't think as fast as you do. Give them a few minutes, and it's time well spent. You'll find out more about what's going on with them that way than you will if you rush in, bury your head in a computer, and rattle off a bunch of questions over your shoulder. That does not work. Try to change the physical plant in the exam room. Don't have them behind you. It's set up old style at Phelps where I am. I deliberately have the chair put next to the door so I can look at the patient at the same time while I'm typing. What I do is once I have the initial visit, I stop and I tell the patient, "Okay, I'm going to check your files and I'm going to get caught up with the computer." And I turn my back to him and I start typing whatever I need to type. Be careful about the doctor-patient communication in the office. It's vital. It really is. You have to open up your heart and your mind to enjoy medicine. And there's way too much emphasis on, I think, on technical stuff, which we've done brilliant work at it since I started and since you've started. But I think the personal element has suffered. I really, truly do. What do I mean by opening your heart? You have to allow yourself to get into the world of the person. You have to find a way to connect with them. And that can be through a number of different things. I had a patient that came in and he had heart disease when he was 36 years old. They had a bypass. I saw him, his grafts closed. I opened up the grafts. Sorry, I opened up put in some stents, and he did fine. And then he comes in with a letter and he says, I want you to fill this out for me. I'm moving to Nashville. I said, why? He said, I'm going to work for Gibson Corporation. I can make more money making mandolins there than I can here. And I said, on my own, I said, well, here's where a joke gets you. I said, you're not going to leave before you make one of those for me, are you? And he said, I have a demo that I can sell you, but I don't have time to make one from scratch. So he sells me the demo. I teach myself to play the mandolin, and he's a happy camper. He goes off. But the point of the story is that we had a connection. We had a connection through music, it turns out. 4 years later, he's in Nashville, home of Vanderbilt, not a trivial place. He has unstable angina, and he calls me. He drives all the way back to St. Louis, has a cath, has a redo operation. And so I brought the mandolin and I played it, and he said, I'm proud of you. I said, why? He said, I thought you were going to put that on the shelf. I didn't know you'd actually learn to play it, but I did. But anyway, it's just, the whole point is just that your life and the patient's life is so much more rich if you can open up your mind and heart to the patient and really get to know them as people, develop an interest in them as people. I had a barber years ago who complained of chest pain. So he called me. I got him in the hospital, took him to the cath lab, canceled my whatever. Got him in. Ours looked like sausages. Had a 6-way bypass, and so he's from the old school. He was German, and he said, I will cut your hair, but I won't take any money for it. And I said, Eric, you got to take the money. And he said, no, I will not take money. So I quit going because I didn't want to take advantage of the guy. So then I went back to him and he said, where have you been? And I said, well, I didn't want to take advantage of you. He said, who cut your hair? And I said, well, so-and-so and such and such. They said, that's a terrible haircut. Don't ever go back there. I want you to come here. I want you to come here. I said, okay. So I did a few things for him, but to make up the difference. But yeah. So the long story, very short, with Eric was, he developed prostate cancer, and so he was sick. So he was at home. So I brought him, made some chicken soup, and I brought it to him. He lives out of town in DeSoto, so I visited for a while. And so he came. They transferred him in. Long story, very short. He passed away this morning at 2/18, And his son said that that I had no idea what the relationship that I've had with him meant to his dad. And to me, that's the best compensation you can get. And that's much more important than how much time off you get or how much they pay you. And I don't know how to put that into words, but that's what's missing. That's why people don't enjoy their jobs, in my opinion. And so you have to open your heart up out, and you have to find a way to get on the same wavelength as the patient. It can be through common interests. It can be through something, or they can teach you about something that you don't know about. But that is just so vital to enjoying what you do. It's just really critical. The last thing I'd mention is you should go the extra mile. Take the time, do it. If for example, last week I had somebody who was going to need to have a renal arteriogram and a stent put in for whatever reason. And so I could pawn it off to the PA or the MA or whatever, and have the medical assistant call and tell them that they're going to need a procedure. But they're going to be upset by that because they weren't expecting it. So take the time, call the patient, and if you need extra time to discuss it, tell them that you'll need to do it in an office setting. But pick up the phone and call. If a patient needs little medications, you have to fill out the forms because of new medicines, whatever reason, fill out the forms for them. If they come in and they just lost their husband, spend the extra 10 or 15 minutes, learn something about grief counseling, learn something about the dynamics of working through a loss of a loved one. Support these people, help them out when they need the help. Other examples, if they ask you to look at something, doctor, I got a bump here. Look at the bump. Maybe it doesn't fit cardiology, but I look at bumps all the time. And the first thing I say is, I am not a dermatologist, and it was my worst subject. I tell them that straight up, but I look at it. Any complaint they have, just pay a little bit of attention to it. One time I had a patient come in and he said, thank you for saving my life. Well, in cardiology, that's not unusual, but I couldn't remember saving the man's life. I said, I'm sorry, I can't remember doing anything that saved your life. He said, a year ago, you found that I had a mass in my abdomen, and you sent me, and they found that I had a kidney tumor, and it was removed, and otherwise I've been dead. I said, well, I'm glad to hear that. So examine the patients, put your hands on them. They won't feel like they got a full exam unless you touch them. You've got to touch them. Don't be afraid to go ahead and go over everything on them. Don't just depend on the tests to do it. And I think if you go the extra mile and you work for the patient's benefit, and you do the best that you can, and you bring that to the fore, I think that you will still, in this day and age, as many complexities have been introduced, you'll still really love what you do, and you can have a wonderful career. I really think so.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time to do this interview. That's actually one of the best interviews I've had, and I appreciate it. We'll let you know.